back to Plato's Cave. With me today, I have Cameron Boult. Cameron is an associate professor and chair of philosophy at Brandon University in Canada, and his key areas of interest are in ethics and epistemology, and of course, their overlap is something that we're going to be talking about today in epistemic blame. So, Cameron, thanks so much for talking with me.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
So, I was reviewing kind of your larger work before this, and I saw that. So, is it right that you have a book under contract right now called The Puzzle of Epistemic Blame?
That's correct. Yeah. So
Yeah, do you know the release date?
I'm supposed to have everything into to OUP by June, um,
Okay.
and I'm on kind of the third draft of it, and I'm just sort of getting another round of sort of some comments from people,
Mhm.
and once I kind of digest the last few things I want to kind of fix and look at in the book, I think I'm hoping to maybe push it out a little bit earlier than that.
Okay, nice. That's the first time I've ever heard of someone being ahead of schedule for a academic
Well,
book
hoping that's
publication.
like sort of
Yeah,
the
that's true.
operative there.
Yeah, operative word there is hoping. So yeah, I think I mentioned this to you in the invitation email, but I we were so I'm in the master's program at Houston, and in one of our seminars we came across, or rather, it was assigned to us one of your papers paired with one of Jessica Brown's papers on epistemic blame, and the concept really kind of gripped me, and I've continued to kind of like think about it since, and it's really a super interesting topic that is more or less a direct parallel to the moral blame debate, which was a debate that I was also interested in before reading about this. So I guess maybe in talking about epistemic blame, I guess maybe we should get the concept on the table at first. So when we talk about epistemic blame, in your view, what are we talking about?
Yeah, I guess the way that I like to frame sort of the concept is it's a kind of blame that's directed uh, towards someone for an epistemic failing
Mm.
from the epistemic point of view. So sort of that those two components I think are important to emphasize, because I think we can sometimes blame people, for epistemic failings in a way that's not really deserving of like distinctive treatment. Like I think
Mm.
sometimes we form biased beliefs, or well, yeah, I'll just stick with that example, and that kind of just seems like blameworthy in a garden variety, like morally blameworthy kind of way. Like if you've got deep prejudices or something,
Mhm.
that are also epistemically flawed. So it's when the kind of blame that we're directing at someone for an epistemic failing, um, when it's like done from the epistemic point of view, right? Sort of
Mhm.
specifically qua epistemic failing, then it sort of seems like there's something distinctively interesting, or at least worthy of further examination, that we may or may not be able to kind of get a handle on theoretically just with existing resources in the moral blame literature.
Yeah, yeah. And I guess also paralleling the moral blame literature, there's, I guess, a lot of, and this is something we'll talk about, but there's a big discussion about sort of different conceptions of what we mean by blame, what it means to blame people. Um, but if I understand correctly from, your writings and the other things that I've read, it does seem like ubiquitous to all accounts of blame in the epistemic literature, but also in the moral literature, it is always, blame is a negative um, evaluation or affect towards others. It's it's always going to be in the negative direction, and it's always going to be in response to, I guess, in the moral domain, it's often in response to something someone did. But in the epistemic domain, it's going to be responding to, like you said, epistemic concerns around either propositional beliefs or belief formation, or it's going to have to do with sort of for lack of a better word, like epistemic domain material in some sense. Is that right?
Yeah, and no, so that's a really good point. I mean, it's kind of a central topic in kind of moral philosophy that discusses blame, is like what's the nature of blame exactly. and is there one, or is there something kind of like centrally, or central to the concept of blame that we can say kind of unifies all the things that we pre-theoretically think of as blame? Um, but I think, yeah, you're right. Like one thing everyone agrees on is it's like a kind of negatively valenced response. Um, Beyond that, I'm not entirely sure if there's a huge amount of agreement actually, like whether it requires an affective component, um, whether it needs to be outwardly expressed. There's so many different kinds of sort of dimensions to our blaming practices that make it a super hard issue. But I guess, one thing that I kind of like to focus on as a sort of, I think of it as a theoretically neutral starting point, is that like whatever blame is, and this I think holds true of both moral and epistemic blame, it's a kind of response that goes beyond just negatively evaluating.
Mm.
Like there's something um, when we blame people, in addition to kind of noticing or thinking, oh, this person's done something wrong, we're also kind of engaged by that judgment or like
Mm.
exercised by it in a way that goes beyond just the noticing. And that's where I think a lot of the things that people find interesting about blame kind of actually get a foothold. Like that's why you could start doing an ethics of blame because it just seems like being engaged in that characteristic way kind of means that certain things should be true of you, for example. Some people think there's something kind of weird or flawed about blaming someone for a wrongdoing that you yourself just committed, um, or that you yourself are complicit in.
Mm.
So it's like, yeah, that kind of being engaged component of blame seems to go hand in hand with a lot of features of our blaming practices that philosophers, in the moral case at least, find interesting. And kind of one of my like projects is really kind of showing like, well, if we think there's such a thing as epistemic blame, then there's a whole bunch of these sorts of questions that it would stand to reason need to be investigated in the
Mm.
epistemic domain as well.
Yeah, yeah, totally. No, I definitely buy um that if, even still remaining agnostic as to what we're going to sort of pin down as blame, it does have to involve more than just mere negative evaluation. And you can sort of experientially think about that. There have been many, many times where, you can identify either, an action in the moral domain or maybe, a belief or something in the epistemic domain as being, flawed in some way, but just really at like sort of a base intuitive level, it's hard to say that I blame someone for that unless there's this, and that's account agnostic, but there's this extra layer of something going on when you're blaming on top of that. Um, I know this was something that this is actually something that I've kind of been pushed in the direction towards over the past couple months of this semester, but I guess I've been pushed towards the direction of general skepticism about not not conceptual analysis as a whole, but maybe something like blame. I'm wondering if there is anything close to an actual answer to this question of like what constitutes blame specifically. Is there this thing out there called blame that we could either be right or wrong about? And I don't know. I mean, I really have a mixed feeling about it because on the one hand, if you tell me that, yeah, I'm thinking about blame, um, and by blame I mean the response of being grateful towards someone, showing gratitude for them, then I'm like, we're not even talking about the same thing at all. And so there's a way in which I want to be like, that's definitely not blame. Um, but on the other hand, there's these competing accounts that all seem plausible in their own way about blame. And I guess I have this general skepticism about, maybe instead of talking about what really is epistemic blame, maybe we should just talk about what specific sort of thing that we're wondering about. Is it reasonable to modify our epistemic relationships on this basis, or is it reasonable to get angry at someone for believing this, or etc.? So I don't know what you think about that general worry, but I'd be curious to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I am sympathetic to that worry myself. I
Mm.
Blame kind of does just seem like one of these concepts that's sort of squishy enough that you're going to run into some problems quite quickly. Like, well, first of all, coming up with a conceptual analysis, but also getting, having a debate that lasts for any period of time that actually is productive, right? Because you
Mm.
can kind of just lean on different dimensions of it to kind of make your account look good, and then it ends up sort of people aren't really saying anything that seems that important anymore, or worth engaging with. Although, I mean, I think there's some super interesting work on sort of this question, like what is blame? And I think we definitely got some interesting things out of thinking about that, like in a sort of with the aspiration of like finding like something like an account of what blame is. But I think equally so, like a lot of authors have begun just starting from that skeptical point of view and thinking more in terms of like, well, what's the function of like a paradigmatic way that we blame each other, which is already
Mm.
just kind of a very different sort of starting point.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's a good idea. In terms of sort of where I or what I see like my own work on epistemic blame as doing is sort of exactly not really worrying too much about whether my account like
Mm.
captures the essence of epistemic blame, but rather just that it does some important jobs that we want to do, but then kind of like moves forward and thinks about kind of like, okay, so here's what I'm saying epistemic blame is like, and I
Mm.
can say, more about this. I think of it in terms of a distinctive kind of relationship modification. But then kind of like what where can we go thinking about this idea of epistemic relationship modification and what other sorts of jobs can it do for us, both in normative epistemology and also in kind of this topic that I've just been interested in ever since I've basically been doing philosophy, which is just kind of like what's the relationship between the epistemic domain and other normative domains. So kind of like putting the account to work like in other ways.
Yeah. No, I really appreciated that I guess tone to your recent papers that I read because it's really, you're not spending a ton of time really battling it out over like, who's, one definition to rule them all, it's just okay, we're talking about this general concept of epistemic blame here and when I'm talking about epistemic blame, I'm referring to it as this kind of relationship modification account. And then let's just move on to sort of talk about what that looks like and you're not going to be bullish on sort of yeah doing that battle and yeah I think yeah, I'm just kind of like thinking about how I want to I told you I'm writing my term paper on this and I don't know there's this way in which I want to write this like this point talking about epistemic blame in general because I think the point I'm making could be amenable to all these different accounts but at the same time it also seems like certain answers, like what's the appropriate target of blame, for instance, that could actually look a lot different if you're thinking about blame in terms of, you know, on what basis can I modify an epistemic relationship? That could have a very different answer than, in response to what can I become epistemically like angry at someone for. So I don't know. It's just still like, I need to kind of think these questions through and figure out like what manner in which I want to like write about these things because it seems like a fine balance that has to be walked.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, in a sense, that's sort of exactly how I got to thinking about epistemic blame in what's essentially Scanlonian terms, like the whole relationship thing, like that. He's very famous for spending a chapter of moral dimensions, like basically almost like as if it's an afterthought or something, coming up with this account of what blame is.
Mm.
Which I don't, and I think he's explicitly said he doesn't think of it as a definition or an analysis in any way. I think in a later
Mm.
piece, he calls it an interpretation. Uh, but
Okay.
it's kind of become like considered like one of the options for
Mm.
thinking about what blame is, sort of. And the reason why I was drawn to it was exactly because it kind of does seem to me a little bit weird to talk about actually getting indignant or like resentful towards a person, like specifically for their epistemic failing. Like if we really want to
Mm.
isolate what we're targeting in the way that in line with how I defined what epistemic blame is, um, then it becomes less clear to me whether like our actual epistemic practices typically involve people or should involve people like going around, resenting one another, like for their epistemic failings from the epistemic point of view. It gets really complicated because obviously, like as we were talking about with prejudice and biases, like it's easy to imagine resenting someone for being prejudiced, towards you, for example. But there, it's like if you talk to any like number of philosophers about this for more than 5 minutes, it just immediately becomes this conversation where it's like, well, but are we blaming them for the epistemic failing there, or like, are we resenting the epistemic failing, or is it really the moral part? Um, so yeah, I kind of just one thing I like about Scanlon's view is because it doesn't give this central role to things like negative emotions. I think it can be put to work in this really interesting way in the epistemic domain that kind of, I think, like can make a lot of different people happy who have different ways of reacting to cases, for example.
Mm-hmm, hmm. Yeah, yeah, we should definitely move on to the Scanlonian account in a second. But I guess in response to something you said there, yeah, so in addition to the papers we read, I also read this slightly earlier paper by Jessica Brown from 2019. And yeah, I've encountered some skepticism just from other people in the class, from different professors that I've spoken to about sort of like the genuine distinctiveness of epistemic blame. And, if it collapses, or is this kind of, if we're abstracting from some sort of moral concerns or something like that. Um, but yeah, I am convinced, by both your work and hers that, maybe it doesn't happen in the real world that we, solely epistemically blame people very often, but it seems pretty clear to me that oftentimes there's a distinctive epistemic dimension to blame. So, when you use the case of someone having sort of like a, prejudiced belief about, maybe like one specific person in virtue of them being from a certain group, right?
Right.
Um, and it seems like, when we blame someone for doing that, no matter the account, there's sort of, there's a dimension of that that seems moral because it's obviously a wrong thing to do. But there also seems to be this like distinctive aspect of blame that is epistemic in nature, that is targeting the fact that this is so obviously something that you should have known better about, or like you're really allowing these just like very obvious biases to influence the way that you actually think about people. And so yeah, it seems like um, even if someone raises this criticism that we never purely epistemically blame, I don't think that that undermines the genuine distinctiveness of an epistemic dimension of blame. I don't know if that is like an argument that has already been used in defense of epistemic blame, but it seems like, if you bite that initial bullet, you still can retreat to the place of saying, well, there's a distinctive dimension of blame that's often epistemic.
Yeah, I think that's a really nice way of putting it, and I think that's a nice way of kind of just being ecumenical in a sense on the whole issue, because I
Mm,
think a lot of people will agree to that point where it's like, okay, even if there's no like time when this happens purely in isolation from moral
mm,
considerations or something like that, it does seem like there's lots of cases where like there's layers or like there like you're putting it dimensions
mm.
to what's happening in our blaming practice.
Yeah. So okay, so on to the Scanlon account, because I love this account actually. It really makes sense of the way that I um have sort of pre-theoretically thought about and engaged in these sort of practices. So we've mentioned that it is kind of centered around this idea of relationship modification, but maybe if you could just explain what you mean by sort of epistemically modifying relationships.
Right. Yeah. So I guess the basic idea is so Scanlon's original account uses this notion of a relationship and relationship modification, and he kind of means relationship in like a slightly technical sense. And I think in kind of borrowing and drawing on some of his ideas, like I went maybe even more technical. with just how I'm understanding the concept of a relationship. But the way I like to think of it is it's just basically reciprocal sets of intentions and expectations that we have towards one another in light of you know, certain practices that we may be engaged in. So like there can be different kinds of relationships, like professional relationships, friendships, romantic partnerships. Scanlon himself is willing to go as far as saying that we all stand in like a general moral relationship with each other, where it's just like we have certain expectations, intentions, and attitudes towards one another, just in virtue of like being the kinds of beings that are capable of justifying their reasons towards one another and
Mm.
capable of having a concern for that. So it's not like a huge kind of stretch to sort of take that idea and say, well, okay, maybe there's like an epistemic relationship, a general one, you know, a kind of relationship where, again, this is like it's not like the perfectly ordinary sense of the term relationship
Mm.
that we have towards other members of the epistemic community just in virtue of being the kinds of beings that are capable of like epistemically justifying their actions and attitudes and being capable of showing a concern for that. And from there, I sort of just take that idea and suggest like, okay, well, maybe our epistemic blaming practices can just be understood as a kind of a distinctive way of modifying that relationship in response to judging that someone's done something to impair it. Which
Mm.
is it really is just like a mirror of what Scanlon's doing. You just kind of have to um, fiddle around with like some of the details to sort of make it seem plausible in the epistemic case.
Yeah, it was sort of it was an interesting experience, talking about this in the seminar because, some people voiced like very skeptical kind of considerations of, do I have, epistemic relationships? Do I modify those? And but for whatever reason, your account instantly clicked with me because it just seems obvious to me that I do, um, have at least like epistemic dimensions to different relationships. So, like, I'm thinking about, I have, sort of a wide swath of friends, and there are, and so you talk about, this is an aspect of your account that I think you've borrowed from Scanlon as well, if I understand correctly, which is that we blame in response to people falling short of the normative ideal, not only in general, but of that specific relationship, right? So I was sort of thinking about, there are certain friends that I have where I place, you draw on this concept too, like a huge amount of trust in their sort of epistemic abilities, and I view them as, just like a like an epistemic collaborator on any question, right? I can discuss anything with them, and I value their input. But there are other people, with whom I only sort of value their input on maybe like a certain range of questions, or maybe like, in the negative sense, not on a specific range of questions. Maybe, there are people in our lives who, like, we just can't talk about politics with, or just talk about religion with, or something like that. um and so it seems right to me that we look at the ideal of sort of specific relationships that we have. And so, for some people, I expect, more from them. Sort of demand like a higher level of epistemic virtue, um, than I do for others. And I guess, I take it, but I'm curious if you see that as sort of like I would assume that you see that as a strong point of your view, that it can be sort of mapped onto different relationships in a way that is like a more general or like platonic ideal wouldn't be able to map on specifically like that.
Yeah, it is kind of one of the things that I sort of think is a nice constructive like feature of thinking in this way. Is and this kind of goes back to what I was saying about focusing more on like going forward from an account rather than just kind of like showing that it captures the essence of something. And this is just obviously whatever's going on, like when we blame each other for our epistemic failings is really complicated. Like there can be so many different flavors to that, and there can be so many different contexts where it seems, those different flavors can be more or less appropriate, and where it's unclear, like kind of really what's at issue. And I think it's exactly this feature of our social lives that we are all kind of like, I guess I like to think of it in terms of like a nested set of
Mm.
relationships. Like, you've got some friends that you're also in professional relationships with. You've got, partners who are also your friends, and you've got, the way I would put it is we, in addition to being in an epistemic relationship with each other on just that general starting point sense, um, we may also, someone may be your doctor or your student. And so I think just using the super familiar and like very natural idea that like sometimes our relationships, the types of relationships we're in with people like overlap, that just to that extent is going to be the case, or the extent to which um, our epistemic blame is kind of going to be impacted by or intermingle with other types of blame. And so it'll just be, on a perfectly general kind of like relationship based account, blame in any domain is just a modification of a certain kind to the intentions and expectations that are literally constitutive of
Mm.
a given relationship. And so, because we're in nested relationships, those intentions and expectations that are constitutive of each type of relationship we're in can just interact with, or kind of be used to just structure kind of like what is going on in a given case. Just to take a really, I think, straightforward example, it's like there's obviously something different about the way you're going to react to your doctor for like negligently not knowing the latest findings in whatever like disease they specialize in comparison with just like discovering that your mom doesn't know the latest findings about that disease.
Mhm.
So I mean, it's kind of like a toy case, obviously, but the point is just like there's something about the doctor example like that's going to license like a much stronger sort of response. And
Mhm.
I don't want to shy away from this idea that like obviously there's something practical going on there, or maybe moral or what distinctively professional. But I don't think that's really an issue for the idea of epistemic blame. Rather, it's just precisely to the extent that there are those other expectations beyond purely epistemic ones, like maybe they're professional ones. Just as the extent to which whatever dimension to your blaming response that's purely epistemic is going to just be impacted by those professional expectations.
Yeah, I mean, I think the case is actually a really good one too, because it seems like in that example, you'd be modifying your sort of other dimensions of your relationship with the doctor in light of your epistemic relationship with him and like his failings in that domain. So, like, presumably you would professionally modify your relationship because he wouldn't be your doctor anymore, right? You would, if you were friends outside of that context as well, maybe you could remain friends, but you wouldn't be able to really talk about medical issues with him anymore or something like that, right? But all of those modifications seem to be resulting from this core epistemic failing that he's had. And it's not it's a professional failing, and maybe a moral one too, but it's a failing of those two in light of the fact that it's an epistemic failing. um at least that's how I see it. Yeah, and I think that, yeah, I'm very convinced by that example.
Yeah, and I mean, it's just sort of the thought being that, like, depending on what sorts of expectations are at play in a given relationship, like certain epistemic failings can take on greater or lesser significance, is, in kind of another way.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, so okay, so a question about the account then. So okay, so if I'm understanding it correctly, there are sort of three conditions, maybe we could say, of this like Scanlonian epistemic blame. So it seems like you have to be in an epistemic relationship with someone in the first place. Uh, And then when one party falls short of the normative ideal of that relationship, then the other party, in response to that, modifies the relationship in light of that failing. So if I'm understanding that correctly, it seems to imply that, you can't epistemically blame people in this way that we've been talking about with someone that you're not in a relationship with. Um, and I wonder if so A, do you see that as a result of your view? But B, if you do see that as a result, is that a problem in your view?
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, I suppose I do see that as a result of the view. However, I think it's easy to kind of get hung up on like the word relationship and kind of
Mm,
forget that it's a slightly technical use of the term.
mm,
And so I kind of like to lean on that point first of all, and then second, just to kind of remind people of what I think of as the significance of blame, right? So I think if you really aren't in any kind of relation with another person at all, whether epistemic or otherwise, to me it just does sound kind of weird to imagine blaming that person for anything. Um, it doesn't sound weird to imagine judging that they're blameworthy, where like what we
mm,
mean by that is like if someone else would be perfectly within their rights to blame them, but to actually be exercised in the way that's kind of like characteristic of blame, even epistemic blame, the thing that sets epistemic blame apart from just negative epistemic evaluation. Um, I'm sympathetic to this idea that there's just something flawed or strange about getting engaged in that way with a person with whom you stand in no epistemic relation to whatsoever. And again, and so then that's the sort of first thing I was saying, like in the technical sense of relationship as well, right?
mm,
So I think this is something that it's very easy to kind of like balk at a little bit. It's like, wait, we're all in an epistemic relate, like just in virtue of being creatures, we're capable of like justifying their beliefs or however you want to frame it exactly. But I think a helpful way of coming at it is just through like our testimonial practices. It's just it's a pervasive feature of human social and political life that we rely on each other like for information in just utterly pervasive ways. I mean, this is just a platitude. And I think, as a reflection of that, we tend to just epistemically trust the word of other people,
mm,
at least within specific domains or on specific questions given the context, unless we've got some sort of defeating reason, right? Or
mm,
something seems amiss about the situation. And so that I think is itself a reflection of this idea that we have certain expectations of one another as epistemic agents, that we are capable of providing actionable information within a certain set of constraining factors. And so just in virtue of being, recognizing that another person is that kind of being, you know, in a very minimally reciprocal sense is enough for me to kind of get this idea, like this Scanlonian notion of a relationship off the ground.
mm.
Um, and that, again, like you've been picking up on, and which I think is right, like that's just sort of a baseline, right? And then, of course, there's all these other layers to our actual social lives that enter the
Mm.
picture.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I buy that. And it also, um, yeah, okay, so that answers one main question I had about the view, but yeah, here's another one. So, um, I think again, if I'm understanding you correctly, it's so we were talking about a little bit earlier, like you could have a view of blame, but like epistemic blame specifically that, um, perhaps so we know that what we want it to be is more than negative evaluation. Um, and one way in which it could be more than that is this relationship modification account. And if I'm understanding you correctly, you said I don't remember in which of your papers this was. I think it was the significance of epistemic blame where this point came up. Uh, and the point was that so relationship modification doesn't have to exclude sort of like emotional reactions, but at the same time, it doesn't. Emotional reactions are not a necessary condition of the relationship modification view. So I guess that makes me think about the question of I don't know. I'm almost because I'm very drawn to the relationship view, but at the same time, I'm wondering if actually the emotive response, the negative emotional response, is actually a necessary condition of the view, in that that is what is the motivating force behind the modification of the relationship. So I guess I'm questioning whether you could have um, genuine modification of an epistemic relationship without an emotional aspect of it that is still more than negative evaluation.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I think this is like a big it's a big issue for some people when it comes to just understanding blame. Because there's people like R.J. Wallace,
Mm.
Susan Wolf, and others who they're really impressed by this like seeming deep connection between like the reactive attitudes understood like fairly narrowly as like types of negative emotion, like resentment or negative emotional response, like resentment, indignation. Like Wallace is maybe strongest on this. I think he really writes as though those type like a susceptibility to those types of attitudes like just is um like part of what it means to really blame somebody. Um, and I guess I've just never found that like compelling. To me, it seems that, and I kind of think like what's at issue here. So going back to something you pointed out, which I agree with, is that like we can modify our relations with one another while being angry about it, or not, in my view. And I think kind of partial part of what's at stake here is just like what plays the kind of core role in explaining the significance. And I just happen to be of the sort of stance that I think when we actually modify our intentions um, towards another person, like intentions that are actually constitutive of our relationship with that person, that had for like that just strikes me immediately as having like a very interesting kind of significance that goes a long way towards explaining like what's significant about blank and also connecting up with potentially like some really natural stories about like what the point of blank is. Whereas I don't find it as immediately obvious that like things like getting angry have that kind of weight because we all kind of know about those moments where we get really pissed off at somebody and it's like it's not that big of a deal. um,
Mm.
like nothing has really changed about your interpersonal relations. So again, this also comes back to the squishiness of blame, right? Because like there's an obvious sense in which like when you're getting like really mad at your friend because you think they wronged you, like that's blame. But to kind of go to your like the heart of your question, I do think that when it comes down to this idea of like modifying intentions in response to a judgment that someone has like impaired your relations and
Mm.
those intentions are like partially constitutive of that relationship, I do think that has the requisite kind of weight to do the job that we want an account of epistemic blame to do. Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting because I mean, again, like almost everything that we've been talking about, it's easy for me to see it on both sides. I want, I was just this idea was sort of motivated by like just thinking about like these experiences that I've had in the past, and it's I wonder, I wonder if part of like how we're thinking about it is, well, because it seems right what you're saying, that we don't always modify it, in this like angry way, or there's not even always that like that, I think Wolf calls it like angry blame dimension of
Yeah.
what we're doing there. But I'm genuinely trying to think about, I don't know that I have ever, because I definitely have modified the epistemic dimension of many relationships, and it's obvious to me also that I haven't always done that on this like angry dimension, but I'm wondering if when it wasn't that, it was always some other negative affect. Maybe it was disappointment. Uh, Maybe it was, um, disappointment would probably be one of the better alternatives to anger. But um, it was just a kind of like loss of trust in someone. But I wonder, I'm skeptical that you can genuinely modify a relationship without that emotive aspect to it. Yeah, but again, it's not, it's a minor point sort of within liking the view as a whole.
Yeah, and I think I don't know if I have anything that is going to be like super convincing about this.
Yeah.
But I do kind of just, again, like it's sort of what attracted me to thinking about in this way. Regardless of whether I think like it's very hard to defend a Scanlonian view, like um, in the moral case, actually, like not hard, but like a lot of people are. It's like a controversial view. Like obviously, all views are fairly controversial, but like it seems to me when I'm talking to people, most people are basically what would get called Straussonians. Like they just
Hmm.
think blame, like the interesting kind of blame is like it's like resentment, indignation, like these kinds of negative emotional responses. And a lot of people like just find that the Scanlonian blame, like just it's too insipid or um, it's just not real blame or
Hmm.
an interesting kind of blame. But that's sort of exactly what I think is useful about it for the epistemic case, is because um, even if it's true that we sometimes genuinely like get angry with each other for our epistemic failings from the epistemic point of view, that's far less of a distinctive and like characteristic feature of I think our epistemic practices. And so an account or a way of thinking about the significance of blame that doesn't rely on those types of emotional responses is exactly what I find attractive. But I totally see where you're coming from. This whole discussion just sort of divides the room. I find this half the room is perfectly happy to kind of jump up and down and get really angry with each other for their epistemic failings, and the other
Yeah.
half isn't.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, it may I mean, it may come full circle to there not being sort of a distinctive thing that blame in general, let alone epistemic blame, is picking out. And yeah, it just might make a lot of sense to talk about these things sort of on their own terms or like, on their own merits. Yeah. So, okay. So, in the little bit of time we have left, I was actually wondering if I could get your reactions to like some things that I was thinking about in this, in response to your papers and some of Brown's specifically. So one thing that jumped out. Um, so I read Brown's papers first, and then yours actually, and uh, this idea or this sort of concern. Was really born of a lot of Brown's examples. And the interesting thing is that it seemed like some of the things that you were using kind of didn't sit on the fence, but they were partaking in both sides. So I want to hear your thoughts about this. Okay, so it seems like, there's this question of sort of the target of blame. And what I mean by that is sort of like, what we point at and say like we're blaming someone for, right? So like in the moral domain, you say like, I'm blaming you for purposefully stepping on my foot or whatever, right? So it's sort of that in virtue of which you blame for. So Brown has these examples where she's trying to motivate the concept of like epistemic blameworthiness, and she talks about us epistemically blaming people for their beliefs. So she has this example of sort of, Maud who believes a proposition on just like ridiculous grounds, and we're supposed to find her blameworthy. And there's the same thing where, we're supposed to find it blameworthy that Trevor does not kind of assent to this proposition for which there's overwhelming evidence, right? And so it seems like, she's really sort of assuming that the appropriate target of our epistemic blame there is belief. Um, Whereas now this was interesting to me in reading the significance of epistemic blame from you. So on there's one page where you talk about this example, and the example is pulled from Lindsay Rettler. Um, where there's a professor of philosophy who is sort of indignant at the unreasonable beliefs of her incoming freshman in the fall, right? I think it was a funny example of like, one of her students thinks that his chances of meeting a celebrity are high just because he's never met one until now, right? It's ridiculous. And so she's sort of, incredulous or indignant at the fact that he believes that. And so that's an example where, again, it seems like the target of epistemic blame is aimed at a belief. Uh, but earlier in the paper, you talk about these sort of you say epistemologists typically use cases of dogmatism, wishful thinking, hasty reasoning, and certain kinds of biased cognitions as examples of epistemic failings for which people can be appropriate targets of epistemic blame. And so the long-winded question that I'm trying to get at is, um, what I'm thinking about sort of writing on in my paper is arguing that the appropriate target of our epistemic blame should not be directed at beliefs, but rather it's these things that you talked about, these sort of like epistemic virtues or vices that people have. And so I'm wondering if you find that at all sort of initially compelling or plausible. And when you were writing about it, was that like a question that you consciously were thinking about, or did you kind of slip into naturally thinking about blame for one of those things?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. I find it really plausible that we don't epistemically blame people just for having a certain belief. I think um, it matters like how they arrived at the belief,
Yeah.
right? And I mean, even almost anybody working on just like the nature of epistemic justification will agree that like etiology matters in some way. Like just think of the basing problem or something for evidentialism. Like it matters how we get to our beliefs, not just for whether they're blameworthy, but also even for whether they're justified. And so I think you mentioned one of your emails, like thinking of this in terms of character and whether really
Mhm.
it's the person's character that is kind of the target of blame is a really interesting starting point for like thinking about this much more. I think you're right. Like I don't spend a huge amount of time talking about this, just because I'm trying to be as neutral as possible about like what the appropriate like targets of epistemic blame are in the service of just focusing on like the nature of the practice. But yeah, I mean, in terms, if we want to think about this in the framework of the relationship based view, um, I think a really natural thing for me to say is nobody like falls short of the normative ideal of the epistemic relationship just by having a belief of
Mm,
whether it's true or false. Because we don't like again the epistemic relationship is just constituted by certain expectations and intentions we have that are like directed towards our epistemic agency, and so having one belief or another just says nothing about whether you're living up to the relevant expectations.
yeah.
The way I'm framing it in the book is in the kind that the content of the expectations is something like this is a little bit technical, but like for any intellectual act that you perform you'll live up to certain epistemic standards, whatever they are.
Mm.
And so, that is going to involve us. That might involve a story about character, about being, intellectually responsible, for example. You can kind of fill in the blank for the epistemic standard. But I just find it very implausible that, like, just by having a belief, however wildly implausible, I don't think that can really be an appropriate target for blame.
Yeah, and like part of what motivated the thought was, you know, I feel like we do this mistakenly quite often, where we do sort of assume that, for instance, like one belief is such a reliable heuristic that you can sort of like, discount someone based on their believing that alone, right? A really good example is, like in the context of US politics, right? Like if someone voted for Trump, there's a reaction to sort of like take that, and to that alone, is all the information you need to know about like that person's epistemic trustworthiness, right? um but it seems to me like there can be those like interesting moments, and I haven't had this, but I'm just imagining, you hear someone voted for Trump, you have that initial sort of unjustified reaction of like, this is all I need to know. um and you're assuming like a lot of things in that, but then maybe you find out that they're actually, like very, very progressive, but they're an accelerationist. They think that things have to actually like get worse before they get better. And like it strikes me that learning that about someone tells you actually like a lot more about their epistemic character than the like propositional content of their belief, like who they should have voted for, right? So that's part of like what the, kind of like concern is. Around again it's more in Brown than you're writing, but sort of the appropriateness of targeting epistemic blame for beliefs. They really do seem to be. I mean, the other concern that I had is that beliefs seem to be very up to kind of what's referred to in the moral domain as like resultant luck. Kind of like luck in how things turn out. It seems like people are very susceptible or maybe even like byproducts of like their epistemic circumstances in some sense. So like, I you know, will change like a view that I have about a position based on the order of papers that I read, for instance, right? So I told you I read like Brown's paper defending kind of the sure account of epistemic blame, and I was drawn to that. And then I read your account, and now so my view shifts, and it seems like if you just change the accident of what if I had never read your paper in the seminar, I might actually be subscribing to like this different belief. So it seems like the propositional like content of our beliefs is very much up to luck in a way that our epistemic character is more immune to. I know that I want to say like completely immune to, but I think it makes sense to sort of blame people in light of um, their epistemic virtue or vice as opposed to that. Um, so yeah, that's just by way of saying like I think that your papers like really motivate the interesting part of that question, because I think that question is like really, really central to our epistemic relationships in a way that it might not be to, just this belief desire pair or like these reactive attitudes, for instance.
Cool. Yeah, well, I'm glad to hear that. I think one of the issues that's connected with this whole topic is it's kind of it's got a very strong political dimension, which is just like, yeah, why? How do people end up kind of believing the things they do, and
Mm,
how do we sort through, or like what exactly is going on in any individual case that makes the person culpable or not? I think it's really easy to spot when someone's violating an epistemic norm, but it's often a lot harder to determine like whether they're actually culpable for that or not. Which that it looks by looking at a little bit of your previous podcasts, it sounds like you've been long interested in just that really deep issue of like how can we be responsible
mm.
for anything, which I've tried to kind of avoid getting into that in any
Reasonably so, yeah.
substantive way, just because I'm kind of more interested in just like the conceptual and connections between the normative domains. But I think that question, like, it looms large for our epistemic blaming practices just as much as our moral practices.
Yeah, no, it's a really cool area of overlap between responsibility and epistemology and ethics. So yeah, I really think that yeah, no skepticism from me about whether or not this is an interesting question to explore. So
Great.
um so yeah, I guess we're coming up on an hour here. So I mean, first of all, thank you so much for the time. I really enjoyed the conversation. And I will post links to the three recent papers of yours that I've been referencing. But if people want to kind of like learn more about like you and your work, where should they go to find that?
I guess the easiest place is just I have a website which
Mhm.
um,
I can link that as well.
yeah, I can
Okay.
give yeah.
It's the Weebly one.
Yes, yeah.
Okay. I have the link for that. Yeah. Okay,
Yeah,
cool.
you know, it mentions the book, and there's a synopsis of the book on there, and that's sort of what I like to think of as kind of the culmination of what I've been thinking about on this topic, and I'm more than happy to send out drafts to if people want to have a look.
Yeah,
Not
yeah.
least because I'm still in the market for feedback on it. So
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, the book sounds awesome. If your work that I've read is any indication, it should be great. So yeah, I'm really looking forward to it.
great.
All right, all right. Stay on the line if you would for a second. But yeah, once again, thank you so much for doing this, and for people listening, I hope that you enjoyed our conversation, and hopefully you will tune in next time.
Thanks so much. It's been really fun.